And I'm just going to recap what I'm saying here. So for the sake of the recording. So the two flows we're very familiar with, the contractual flow and the material flow, pretty straightforward. What UDB has introduced for the purpose of traceability is an information tracking system that tracks all the transactions in the supply chain from the farm to the end user in Europe. And the central office is deemed to be the first gathering point in this process. So that is us, Sustainable Grain Australia, is the first gathering point. We are notionally buying the grain from the grower. As soon as that transaction's been entered into the database, it's then pulled back to yourselves as the traders, who then take ownership of that information. And then as a trader, you are then effectively selling that grain onwards to the next party in the supply chain, who also through UDB is buying it and selling it and buying it and selling it until ultimately it gets to the final end user. Now, in some cases, this will be fairly a direct set of transactions. You'll be physically taking the grain from the grower, aggregating it, putting it on a vessel and shipping it. But in other times, you might be buying on the track market, and there might be a couple of intermediaries in the middle there. Now, obviously, within our grain trading system, being firstly from an ISCC point of view, where mass balance is being used, obviously the physical grain is not being traced back to the farm, but also with the bulk handling system we have, there is no way of effectively tracking the grain from a vessel back to an individual farm. So even though we have to comply with the system, we have to make it work for the operations and the way we physically move grain and contractually move grain around Australia. We move grain and export to Europe. The last slide that I'll put in is that because central office is effectively and notionally buying this grain as a first gathering point, there is the need for you who are actually physically buying the grain from the farmers to supply information to us, to the central office, on a frequent basis. So at the moment, you will supply that information once a year in February of the trades that you've conducted. Now this has to be provided to central office on a much more frequent basis. We'll yet to establish what that is, whether it's weekly, daily, but it needs to be supplied electronically in a set format on a frequent basis, so that you can then pull that information back down into your system through UDB, and then you can continue to trade down the supply chain. So in a nutshell, that's what the process is. It's something that I think most of you are aware from previous calls. We, Australia, have been pushing back very heavily from a governmental point of view, arguing that this is a restriction on trade. It's adding unnecessary cost and complexity to trade to Europe. It's of no value-adding aspect whatsoever, and it does not fit a bulk handling mass balance supply chain. Despite the best efforts of the team in Brussels in the Australian Embassy, and to be fair, they've had good, constructive, productive dialogue with the parties in the European Commission, as have the Canadians, as has the Argentinians, and increasingly as have the European states. This is actually anchored in EU legislation, and it can't be undone or stopped. It may be delayed, but it won't be stopped. That's the messages we're told. So I'm just echoing those. I'm not sort of laying down the law here. So that's the situation we now have to deal with export of canola into Europe. And at this point, I'll stop share and I'll hand over to Lyndall to run through the demonstration on the dashboard that we see. So this is the dashboard that we see as a central office. As a trader, you will have a different screens that you will deal with. I'm not sure if we're able to show those or not, Lyndall, but I'll hand over to Lyndall to now just give a demonstration slowly of the process that we go through. As you'll see as we move through this, it's incredibly manual and labour intensive. The intent is that this will be all automated, but I think it's important that everybody understands the process in a very manual way, which is what we're going through today, so you're aware of the steps. But in the meantime, we, as the central office, are looking at ways and means of automating this so that it does not involve the sort of manual information input that you're about to experience. Lyndall. Thanks, Lyndall. You're on mute.
Yep. Sorry. Thanks, Nick.
Yep.
So perhaps I'll just start with a step that you can't see. And prior to being able to report in UDB, each of the traders, buyers, will need to upload their sites into ISCC. We don't have any certified sites, so I'm not able to show you that. But when those sites are loaded into ISCC and approved by your auditor, they then flow into UDB, and then they're made available for you to have stock trade like stored against them or bought in against those sites. So that's an important step that you'll need to do prior to being able to use UDB. The other two things that need to happen before we commence is the upload of the sourcing contacts, and the sourcing contacts are the growers. Each of the growers, each NGR has to be uploaded into ISCC. Sorry, just need to get. Oh, here we go. So each grower is loaded up, and that's done by the central office, which is us. So we'll be uploading each grower, each NGR number, and the information that they require with that. So that is not something that you will need to do. But this is what an individual contact looks like. They require a maximum estimated capacity and an address, but we're at this point not uploading the email and phone numbers. It's not a requirement, so we're keeping the data as discreet as possible. Once you've got your stocks in, then we're hoping it will be, we don't know the date yet when this will kick off, but you have the opportunity at that point then to upload your initial stock register prior to beginning reporting. And that's important to have your mass balances at those sites that you're certified for in UDB, because that means that you can trade previously purchased grain that isn't going to be captured as part of the reporting. So you get an opportunity to upload your stock balance as at a certain date, and then and you can trade that grain, but then from then on you will need to be reporting on a transaction by transaction or at a weigh note level. Unfortunately, because again we don't have any sites as SGA, we don't have an ability to upload that, but this is the area that it is, and the information they're looking for is the site, the registration date, the material, which will be canola, your quantity, and your unit is tonnes. Once you've uploaded those initial stocks, you don't get a second opportunity to do that at that site. So, yep, it's just a once off, but we'll be getting in touch with you closer when we have information about when this will start and when the it's important that you put in the stocks as late as possible to capture everything you've purchased prior to having to do these, the reporting going forward. So, this is what the transactions look like. So as Nick mentioned, we have to do a transaction from the grower to SGA and then from SGA to the trader in UDB. So this is the managed transactions page, and at the moment, each transaction is captured here. You can see Toby at Vitera, big shout out to him. He's been a great resource to me. We've been able to actually do a few transactions and test the system and get a feel for some of the issues and how it works. So that's been good. We've been able to provide feedback to UDB, and they have made some updates as a result of that. So to show, I'll do this is the first transaction that I'm doing is from a grower to SGA. In that, with our seller is our sourcing contacts. So the buyer at this point defaults to Sustainable Grain Australia. This is SGA's certificate of currency. The company reference number is, effectively that's your weigh note, but we've been looking at potentially putting a string of information in there because when the transaction goes through, you don't see very much info. The trade date has been agreed. The trade date, loading date, and delivery date for these transactions will be the date that you supply it to us and that we actually upload the information. We won't be allocating the grain to a site. SGA will be making the transaction as a not physically stored direct sale. That means that when you accept the grain when you accept the transaction to you, which will be the second one I do, you can allocate at that point where you want that stock to sit. And we at this point are suggesting that we work off the port zone, the port locations, to remove the need to do transfers of grain from upcountry sites to the ports. Otherwise, that's additional reporting that you would have to do. So then I don't have to include a place of delivery. The material is canola. The quantity, we're just going to do 1 tonne. The unit is tonnes. The material type is always nuts too, which then converts this to canola seed. The country of origin is Australia. For the nuts 2 region, we just select the state. So in this case, we'll just put South Australia. It populates an emissions value for us based on the state that the canola is coming from. And you have to select that it's completed, and then you can save it. So one thing to be aware of, once this is unfortunately quite common, apologies. It times out quite frequently. So that transaction is a grower delivery that a weigh note that has gone from the grower to SGA. And then the next step SGA has to do is the transfer of that grain from SGA to, in this case, I'll transfer it to Viterra. So this is the transaction here. You can expand it and view more detail at that point. Once a transaction has been accepted, though, you cannot change it. You can't edit it. So there are some limitations and a need for that accuracy when uploading things. So then that was the create part A, food and feed crops. The next one is to create a transaction. And this is when I transfer it to the buyer. So in this case, I put in it's a little clunky. They're selecting that one. Yep. Again, it's our registered certificate. The company reference number. So that was the weigh note number. The trade date for us will be the same because we're just, the system assumes that there's a physical movement of grain each time there's a transaction, which, as we know, isn't the case. But so I have to put in a place of loading, which is doesn't actually exist, but and then at this point, it shows the loads that we have available that we've uploaded. Just select this one. We put in a quantity of 1. We then have to confirm.
I've got a quick question, Linda.
Yep.
How when you described that transaction there, was that just a single load from a grower, or was that the total transferred?
No, it's load by load at the moment. Yep.
That's great. So, and that's supposed to be eventually automated, so that'll just happen in the background without someone clunkily having to transact that.
Yes, that's what we're looking at doing, is creating an API, a link, so that we get a data file. All the loads at this stage will still need to be reported to us individually, but rather than manually entering it in, having an API to transfer that data across. So that's what we're working on at the moment, but we felt it was important to understand how the system works on a manual basis to then be able to know that the information that we're providing is correct, and that it's correctly demonstrating how even though SGA doesn't physically take any stock, but to ensure that we were utilizing UDB correctly, we felt it was important to understand how to do it manually first. To kind of, because some of the fields and things are not very clear if you're looking at it for the first time.
Yes.
Yep.
All right, thanks.
That's okay. Now that transaction is sitting in here as pending, which you can see it's a paper trade back to back to Viterra. Toby, are you able to show, are you comfortable with showing what it looks like at your end?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it's a test transaction, so that's
Yeah,
that's
it's
no
not
problem.
it's not a real.
Yeah. Cool. Just let me know if you can see that.
Yep, it's there now.
Sweet. So we'll get a notification in the top right when we have any pending transactions to either accept or something that's been rejected. So I can see here there's one pending. Oh, you get a session refresh. And so you can see that here. I'm not sure if they've fixed this bug yet, but normally that won't actually open the transaction, frustratingly. All right, so we can see the transaction now that has been sent through from SGA. I can see the details, but I can't actually accept it in this screen, which anyway. So
Another thing we're working on with
yeah. So you'll have to go to transactions, manage transactions, and then down here you will see the transaction with an action. And so you can tell that this is the one that's got the tick, and you can see the transaction. Well, you can't actually see the Viterra transaction number anywhere here. You kind of just have to click through to see it. So there we go. And now I have the option to accept the transaction or reject it. So if we go through, continue. And so now that's been confirmed. So that's it. That's done.
So that's come across as an unallocated
Correct.
transaction that you'll then need to allocate to
a site.
Yep.
Yep. Separately through another type of transaction.
Yep.
So that would be a separate one because it's a paper back-to-back transaction. It's just going to come into our essentially head office SGA account, UDB account. Sorry. So then I'd have to allocate that, and I could move those tons around through a managed transactions, and then creating a transaction, and then create an internal movement, and then through that internal transfer, I could pick a place of loading, which would be the Viterra head office, and then pick a place of delivery. So I could pick one of our registered sites under our certificate, and then move that material and tonnage across, just as Lyndall's shown us.
Yep. Unfortunately, when we're working with UDB at the moment on improving this, but currently you accept transactions on a waynote by waynote level when it's being done manually. Where we've been talking with UDB about some options to build in about grouping information so you can accept multiple transactions at once. But that's essentially where it's at. And then you get the other thing we're looking at is being able to see stock balances at a location, which is a bit clunky at the moment as well. But essentially that's the SGA component of the reporting that comes in. So we'll be setting up the sourcing contacts and using the information from the self-assessments and the self-declarations that growers complete. For old crop, we're uploading previously reported growers. So if they didn't sell sustainably this year, hopefully we've captured, but they did previously, they should still be captured in this. Does anybody have any questions or anything they'd like me to?
Paul here from Centre State.
Yep.
Couple of things. One is I encourage everyone to contact ISCC because we've been toing and frying with them for about 2 weeks now with our certified sites. I think they got a new operator at their end who has butchered a few things, and we are still trying to get that ironed out so that our certified sites flow through to the UDB. We were told overnight that would be sorted out. So I'd encourage everyone to go and have a look in the hub if you haven't already, to go and see what sites you have available to you. We also, I guess we've played around with it a little bit, and one of my questions is to you, Lyndall and Nick, is so in the short term, the way that we're looking at it is that we'll use our initial stocks. Go back a step. Now harvest is complete in South Australia, and we think we've purchased the bulk of the grain that we will for the year or shortly will have. We're going to use our initial stocks to cover our initial requirements. What we're doing at the moment is isolating tickets that we know we're going to use for those initial stocks, so that when it comes time to report to you guys for the first time for this purpose, separate obviously to our auditing requirements, but specifically for the UDB, we'll say to you at some point, hey, here's all of our tickets for auditing purposes, but here are the tickets that we want you to upload into the UDB for us, because we've already counted these tickets over here in our initial stocks. And I guess also just want to make sure we have a process that everyone is aware of, that this is really, it really is taking away from how we've all seen this system as a mass balance thing, where we now have to be really more specific about what tickets we provide. I also note with the testing that we've done with you guys and Toby, who a credit to him, has been done a lot more work than most of us on this, as Lyndall has, but it's linked right back to that initial transaction. And what we found is, you know, it wasn't like we could re-lump our grain into another transaction. It's always going to have a link to that initial grower transaction between SGA and the grower, and then us and SGA. So it's got a lot of work to get up to being properly functional, but yeah, I just probably want to flag that to make sure that we're all aware of what you require of us when it comes time to give you the first ticket file, basically.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's a really good point, because the reporting that we're doing for UDB does not negate the fact that we still have to report everything to ISCC as well, but that is on an annual basis. So what we want to do is make sure that the information we capture from you when we give you the file format we require, we can capture everything we need for both lots of reporting. But as Paul has said, when that initial stock comes through, when you're putting your initial stock balances in, we will still need to know the individual loads that you purchased this season for the ISCC reporting. So I've made a note of that, and Nick and I'll have a chat about how, like, what Paul's doing is great, is segregating that information into the ones that are will be going into the mass balance, and then so that we can still do the ISC reporting on that, and then the ones going forward from there that we will need to upload for your transactions. So we'll make sure we have some communications to everyone, making that really clear.
It might just be worth adding there too, on the initial stock registration, it is a one-time action. So you can only do that one time. You can only register your initial stock balance once per registered site. You can't go back and amend the quantity or add quantity to that initial stock registration. So it's a point in time. And once it's completed, then everything going forward will have to be uploaded via SGA in terms of quantity and tickets. So just, yeah, keep that in mind.
Just to add to what Toby said, he is 100% correct. If you were, though, to buy a lump sum of tonnage at a stock, and it's at a location, and it's a new location for you, and you've already done all your other stock balances, you will have an opportunity to do a one-time stock balance transaction for that location. But that's only if it's something new that you've purchased at down the track. Prior to that, otherwise, you just get one shot at putting it in, and then you have to be able to account for all the grain flowing in and out after that is going to the EU.
Lyndall, Paula from GrainCorp. I'm just going to ask a rudimentary question, and I'm just going to go all the way back to the beginning before any of this stock entry is that the tonnes that we're reporting of canola that are going into the EU, is it just for energy consumption? Say if we sold canola into the EU and it was for food consumption, is that still captured in this system, or is it just energy? Or does it not matter? It's all canola.
Nick, what's your understanding
Yeah,
of
no,
that?
it's only, Paula, it's only for renewable fuels. So if it's going to Europe for fuel, then it requires this process, but if it's going for other purposes, it does not.
I think essentially, if you're selling it under your EU certificate, you got to report it. Is what it comes down to.
The other thing to note is that CBH is also going down this same process, so they're equally daunted, I suppose, about this. So we have ongoing conversations with CBH over this, so that we are aligned and we have joint meetings with the embassy team in Brussels. So just to sort of whether that puts mind at ease or not, but CBH is basically in the same boat and trying to come to grips with what this actually involves. One of the things that we had to include was a national identification number for each sourcing unit or each grower, and the fields that they had available were things like the ABN or the ACN, but not the NGR. So we requested UDB to include a field for NGR. So all of you will have access. That field will be available. National Trade Register identification.
It is available. They have made a spelling mistake, and it's now the NRG code rather than the NGR. But it is there as the correct 8-digit number. So that's the main thing that we could, because previously we couldn't input an 8-digit number into the system. It had to be an 11-digit number. So
you say the team at UDB is receptive to input when it's going to make the process flow. So we've had a number of calls with them and raised a number of concerns about sort of the data entry side of it. We've also raised concerns at a higher level, at a government to government level around the whole darn thing. But when it comes to the actual data entry side of it, we've been having dialogue with UDB, and they have been receptive around ideas like grouping transactions. So a whole group can be processed as one, not necessarily at by way note. So they appreciate and understand or learning, I should say, about the Australian grain supply chains, and wanted to make this work for us.
We've had a question from about whilst we don't know what time the reporting will start, is there a rough timeline at all?
Yeah.
Nick, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so my understanding is that May the 2nd, 2025 is somewhat of a drop dead date. That's some sort of legislative stake in the sand that's been committed to. So the first stake in the sand was actually November the 21st, 21st,
Right.
yeah. And sorry, the other one is May the 21st. So November 21st, each economic operator, in this case, that's us as the central office, had to upload grower details, which we have done and started doing from that date. And that was a commitment that the EU Commission was holding UDB team to because of some legislative requirement. But the next stake in the sand is the May the 21st, by which we understand it needs to be operational. So as we get more updates on this, we'll let you know. But I think it was prudent to pull everybody together now at this, before we go on holidays and break, because by the time we get back into gear in January, this will be fast approaching. So I know for some of you, this might be the first exposure you've actually seen of the portal, of the UDB interface. And some of you still having trouble getting logins and so on. So, and I know some of you contacted me on that. So if that is still the case, just let me know. And we'll see if we can sort out what we can do to help. So between Control Union, ISCC and ourselves, we'll endeavour to make sure that you get access to the database so you can have a bit of a play around. There is a demonstration database that you can literally play around with, and there's the real one, which is what we've actually been using, moving a ton here and there just to sort of physically do it. So it's, and from what I understand from CBH, who are using the test environment is actually a few generations behind the real environment. So as they've made changes to the system, they haven't necessarily replicated those in the test environment. Yeah, they've got both environments operating for you to play with. There is a lot of information on the web. There's called a wiki, the UDB wiki, I think it's called, or wiki UDB. So if you need links to that, unless you can bring it up quickly, Linda will put it in the chat. There's a lot of information, and guidance books and, process charts and all the rest of it, to help you through the way.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Nick, for people that would like to, that don't currently have access to that testing environment and need it, how do they go about getting it?
Good question. I think it's through the UDB, make a request to UDB.
Right, I've just put a link to the public wiki in the chat.
Oh, good, great.
So, for people that need it. And it looks, I'll just share my screen again. One thing we are aware of, from time to time, when we've queried things, we've been receiving advice from UDB. It's not always reflected or updated in the training materials. So if you come across anything, if you are looking at this that you feel is concerning, feel free to reach out to us first, because it may be something that we've been working on and we do have a bit of additional information about that they haven't provided in their training materials. They haven't been updated for a while.
Hi, Nick. It's Ian here. Just a quick question, just to clarify from my understanding. So if a vessel is sold into a counterparty in Europe, that is what you're saying here. This means that there's going to be, 1,500 individual transactions at ticket level that have to be managed manually, give or take.
Yep. At this stage, that is how it is. That is how it's working. And now the 1,500, you're probably referring to 1,500 growers.
Yeah.
Actually, it could be 3,000 weigh notes that sit behind that if they've made 2 deliveries each. So
Yeah.
it's actually worse than you paint. We have at least asked, can we at least group weigh deliveries under the one grower? And they've said yes, if it's the one greenhouse gas value from the same material, and from the same grower, yeah, that can be grouped. But your point is still valid. It's 1,500 individual transactions, which ultimately is not workable. We're learning this on a manual basis, but it has to be fully integrated through APIs so that the data flow is seamless.
Yeah.
And the ISCC is developing a data aggregation platform, I suppose you'd call it. And there are 2 private providers out there as well that ISCC have vetted that basically can take the data and say, I don't know how they take it, but let's assume it's a spreadsheet, you know, an Excel file or a CSV file, take it in that format, upload it and aggregate it and enter it into UDB that way. So there are service providers in development and underway or in existence to assist with that. Of course, we haven't, of course, that comes at a cost. We've not explored that yet, but we are looking to see if we can manage this ourselves through our existing process, because you already supply us data in a CSV file on an annual basis. Can we take that information on a more regular basis, either as a CSV file, but ideally as an API that feeds into our system that then can talk directly with UDB?
Yeah, no, that's clear. Thank
So
you.
we haven't got, we can't say we've got a solution yet, and but your point at the outset, at this stage, yep, it's 1,500 individual transactions have to be passed down the supply chain through UDB.
And not just you uploading 1,500, but the buyer at the other end has to then accept 1,500 in.
Correct. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So they have, it has been suggested at times that this is no extra cost or no extra effort
Value.
on behalf of the industry to do the reporting, but that's I'm not sure I agree.
So even like, you know, domestic Australian trader to trader sales need to go through this.
Yeah. So if you're buying on the track market for liquidity purposes, you're not actually necessarily planning to sell to Europe, but you want to have ISCC in your ISCC canola in your stores, so that you've just got that liquidity and you can trade a bit. Yes, you'd still have to go through this process.
Right.
And I just reiterate that, you know, we're not the sole voice crying out about this.
No, I understand.
You know, and we're getting the international companies, some of whom are represented on this call, the European head officers are pushing back as well as government to government levels from like-minded countries, including those in Europe.
Yeah.
But as I said, it is legislated, so unless something can happen from that at that level, European Commission legislation point of view, this is how it's going to, this is going to be the new world.
Yep. No, that's clear. And just one last thing, just so I think I heard this correctly. So when we're talking about uploading sites into UDB, that is definitely at our level of our mass balance, i.e. port zone level. Are we talking each individual storage up country site here?
I think it's going to be one. I mean, personally, I think it's going to be one to discuss directly with your auditor. So your certification body. I think you're probably best to handle that question through them, and then they can probably start the conversation with the ICC team. Again, some of us might not have all our country sites listed on our certificate, and currently you can only upload the sites that are covered within your certificate. So through your audit process, that's all the colour I'd add there.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Toby. Cheers.
If you just keep in mind that UDB doesn't ever allow you to move or go into a negative stock balance. So the more grain you have up country, you're going to have to do additional internal stock movements to get it to port to then be able to go through the sale of it, like for when it gets exported. So that's just something to keep in mind about your resourcing, because that's you know, additional input, you know, and stock movements within UDB to that. I would suggest if you can avoid it, it would be beneficial.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
We're looking, am I correct, Lyndall? We're looking to have a standard approach whereby it goes from sourcing unit to port zone. Is that what we've been talking about?
Well, we're not going to our approach is at this point not to allocate it anywhere, and the individual traders can determine where they want to accept that grain into, whether it's an upcountry site or a port zone. We've been talking about we've talked to UDB about, can we just report at a port zone level or a port level? You can't actually accept into a zone, it's a location. They have said yes at this point, but Toby brings up a good point in that it is something you might want to check with your auditors to make sure that there are no issues with doing that later on in how you're accounting for your stock balances.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Appreciate that.
It's worth adding to, I mean, I think Nick you've kind of already covered this off, but that May 21st deadline, unless the timeline gets extended, once the EU's made a decision and that this will become mandatory and enforced usage, we then have essentially a month before we must start using the UDB, and we're probably as traders going to see that first come in the form of, you know, requests from our counterparties to have the trade also facilitated or represented within the UDB itself. So yeah, probably have a month once we know it's mandatory, and then we'll have to be ready to go, is the way I see it at the moment.
Sorry,
Yeah,
another.
I was just going to say, with that in mind then, should we not be rushing into doing too much? Like, we've all got this one chance with our initial stock. The longer we leave it, the more, like, consider the time of year we are now that harvest is pretty much finished in most areas in Australia, predominantly with canola. We know what's there now to some degree. The longer we leave it, the more we can capture with our initial stocks, the better, in my opinion. So
on the same page, Paul. I agree.
Yep.
Yep.
I agree too, Paul. I've actually talked to them about trying to get a definitive end date for when the sourcing, your mass balances can be uploaded, and we're pushing for that to be as close as possible to the start of the reporting.
When you talk about mass balances, are you just talking about mass balance for the export to EU? Because there'll be other destinations that will be taking ISCC canola, but are we just reporting into the UDB the tickets that we're going to use to put on a boat effectively to send to Europe? Or is SGA requesting that all of our mass balance tonnes are entered into UDB?
That's a good question, Paula, because we will need all of the, for the ISCC reporting, we will need to know all of the loads that you've purchased. I think correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, it did sound like UDB wanted it all put in, and then you could do a reconciliation and move out what you didn't transfer, like what didn't go to the EU. However, we do understand that is not necessarily an approach that everybody's comfortable with. Nick, do you have anything?
That's what I took out from that message as well. You can back it out later on.
I just think that that's a vision on individual businesses that isn't in any way, shape or form needed for the European Union to know.
I think some feedback was given that we considered it overreach, that they didn't need to, didn't need to know it all. I guess the only thing is if you changed your mind about some of those loads, you'd need to upload them later.
If you've sold the grain using your EU certificate, so it's possible that it could end up in the EU, even though it's going to a different destination in the meantime, it still needs to be reported as far as I'm aware, because your customer that might be in China or Japan or somewhere else may well then want to sell that further on into Europe, which means it's a part of the chain. So if you're selling to destinations outside of Europe, generally I would have thought you're using your ISSE plus certification, which is not required to be reported. So I think it comes down to your certificate and what, if you're using an EU certificate, that's what they want you to report.
I'd just say it comes down to the individual trader, and if you've got the best forward planning in the world and you know exactly the volume from exact port zones, and you can manage that on a grower basis, then I guess only upload those tickets. But at the same time, if you're doing track trade, domestic trade, and on ICC EU certificates, say for instance, between GrainCorp and Viterra, would probably expect that transaction to be, for a sustainable canola transaction, to be uploaded and facilitated in the UDB. So I think, it's going to come down to how each trader wants to approach it. And I guess SGA is there just to facilitate the upload of that data at the end of the day, as well as guide us, obviously.
Okay, we've probably raised more questions than answers, but thanks for the questions that have been asked, and hopefully we've provided some answers, but it does present a whole lot of additional work for the process of exporting grain or canola to Europe. We are still continuing to push back through the embassy in Brussels on this, but I think it's important that we start the year with the attitude that we have to do this, and if in the end we don't, fantastic, but it looks like that's a very thin opportunity. More likely this is the way it's going to have to operate, but it will be driven through APIs between yourselves and ourselves and UDB, and I guess yourselves and UDB as well. It can't operate functionally at the sort of numbers that we're talking about with manual data. It suddenly makes the whole export program unviable, at least to that market. Conscious we've just gone for an hour, unless other people have questions, but feel free to direct any further questions to us. What's your timescale? Thanks. What's your timescale for APIs up and running? We've actually got our developer sitting in on this call as well, to sort of just understand a little bit more around the challenges and what's involved. So at this stage, we have not got a timescale for it, and I'd like to think by end of first quarter, but not until we've got a full spec of what's involved from an API point of view can we really give a timing to it.
And UDB is still updating all of this too, so that we're finding changes week to week when we go in. So it needs to be a stable platform as well before we can 100% commit to an API, because we don't want to build something right now that in 3 weeks' time no longer works.
Okay. On that note, I expect we'll get some phone calls after this, but thanks for joining us today at this time of the year, and let's see what 2025 has in store for us in terms of this process. But I wish you all a very happy Christmas and safe time, and we'll start 2025 with all guns blazing around this to get this all sorted.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you.
Just one point, just to clarify, most of you probably aware I'm finishing up with AOF at the end of this year. So Steve Howells, who I think might be on the call, is now the new lead for AOF, but I am staying on a little bit longer from an SGA perspective, just to help shepherd this particular process through. So I'm not walking out the door just yet, as far as this is concerned. Okay.
But yeah, we'll make sure that recording's shared, Paula.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll put it up on the YouTube channel and put a link to it.
Thanks all. See you
Thanks
next
very much.
Okay, thanks very
Thanks,
much.
guys.
Bye.
Want to hang on, Mendel? And I
Jeff
thought
still
Tony
there?
might have hung on, but Helen, did you find that useful? I know you're working with CSE on this, and as you're still on the line there, did you find that consistent with the work that you've been doing? No? Not there.
No.
Um,
Let's stop recording.
okay, there we go.